I'm going to talk about the idea of the hybrid war and its mobilization against countries like Venezuela and Iran. But in order to get there, I think it's important to understand the very long history of the hybrid war, which comes under so many names in American, US military policy. It comes by names such as low-intensity conflict. In fact, I'm going to read out a few of the names in which we've seen the idea of hybrid war developed over the last 60 years. Small wars, counterinsurgency, foreign internal defense, low-intensity conflict. This is my favorite now. Military operations other than war, which has its own acronym, MOOTW, M-O-O-T-W, military operations other than war. This goes back to, at least in the modern period, the formation of the CIA in 1948, and then the formation of the Special Forces in 1952. You know, it's one thing to have the CIA, but the Special Forces was important. It reports directly to the White House, running through the Pentagon. You have people trained essentially in a kind of warfare where you don't have to mobilize entire armies. Come in, you can assassinate, you come in, you can, put pressure on people, blackmail, and so on. So, that's the world of hybrid war, and it has a very long history. It's important to understand that. It didn't start yesterday. The idea of small wars is a little different than hybrid wars, but low-intensity conflict, military operations other than war, very important concept. I'd like us to spend some time as well on some of the ideological pieces that come behind the idea of hybrid war. In 1962, the Kennedy administration released a document. We got to see it publicly much later, but they released it to the administration on so-called foreign internal defense. I'll come back to this in a minute. And in that document, they wrote, it is important for the United States to remain in the background and not to expose the United States unnecessarily to charges of interventionism and colonialism. It's a very important point. The United States, in other words, acknowledges that its policies are tantamount to interventionism and colonialism. The point isn't not to be colonial. The point is you don't want unnecessarily to expose yourself to the charges of colonialism. In other words, do things that are essentially colonial, but don't let yourself be seen as colonial. I think this is a fundamental part of the ideological world of the concept of the hybrid war. So before I get into some detail about the hybrid war, I'd like to just point out, how has the US government been able to produce amnesia? How has it been able to produce this ability of being colonial without appearing colonial? So 4 very quick points. The first is the government and US history has promoted a sort of implicit faith in the United States government. This idea that when the US government does something, it's not doing it for some nefarious motives. It's always doing it for good. We see this in our time where people will say when the US government bombs a country, it's doing it to save, civilians. It's for humanitarian intervention. It's never for anything other than that. I remember during the time when the United States, which is really the heart of the North American Treaty Organization, or NATO, when the US through NATO was bombing Libya, it bombed Libya with a United Nations resolution 1973. This resolution asked for a review of the bombing. After the United States had completed the bombing through NATO, questions were raised, shouldn't NATO now come back to the United Nations with an after-action report? After all, it was part of the resolution. Peter Olson, the lead lawyer of NATO, lead counsel, wrote a letter to, essentially the UN, but it was indirectly to Human Rights Watch, in which Olson said, the United States or NATO never conducts war crimes. You can never see us as conductors of war crimes. If you find any evidence of it, then it's accidental. In other words, barbarians, other countries, Libya, the Libyan government, barbarians commit war crimes. The United States and NATO, but mainly the United States, never commits war crimes. It only bombs in a homeopathic way for human rights. In other words, the first way in which this amnesia is created is they produce an implicit faith in US power. When US utilizes its power, it's for the good. The second way in which this amnesia is created is the United States says that it's always others that are doing bad things. This Russiagate thing is very much part of it. When the United States overthrows a government, and the list is very long, Albania 1947, Italy, Greece, Guatemala, Iran, it's a very long list. When the United States overthrows governments, well, that's for the good. It's to create the conditions for the free world. But when, say, Russia intervenes in a US election, my God, it's a scandal. So this idea that the enemy is always somebody else, the bad actor is always somebody else, is a very much important part of the creation of amnesia. The third way in which amnesia is created is by a sort of surrender almost. The major cultural industries in the United States, including the academy, television media, print media, and so on, those who shape opinion about particularly foreign policy, have essentially a US State Department view of the world. They are essentially stenographers of US power. And when they're not, for instance, Duke University and the University of North Carolina's Middle East program, pressure can be put on them. The reason I say this, use this example is it's, of course, most recent and it's public. But a lot of this pressure happens quietly. When you come to renew your grant from the US government for foreign language study, privately you are told you've got to be much more in line with US State Department values if you're going to get your grant. So privately they control them in a way. But you don't even need to control. I mean, there's a self censorship. And this self-censorship, you see this a lot in the television media, comes through seeking access from the State Department. If you want the first interview, you better play ball with them. You better have their point of view. But also, this implicit faith in US power, point number one, comes in here. And the culture industries essentially, as people who have this implicit faith, reproduce the State Department ideology. And finally, very cleverly, there is a way in which the discourse of the conspiracy theory is mobilized. So that then, those who believe, for instance, that the aliens are coming in and taking over parts of the US, or that aliens collaborate with the US government, that sort of very far-fetched idea is put into the same framework as people who say the United States is conspired to do a coup against Venezuela. They'll say that these are all conspiracy theories. Now, the first one is, I think to my mind, more in the realm of the ridiculous, but by linking this one about aliens collaborating with the State Department or the Pentagon in Area 54, this, what is really quite a ridiculous idea, is linked to an idea which is that the United States has a conspiracy to overthrow the government of Venezuela, very credible, easily to document and so on. But by linking these two, you create now the sense that this argument is ridiculous. That the argument that the United States is deliberately trying to overthrow a government is a ridiculous argument. Well, if the United States is trying to, and because of implicit faith in US power, then it may be a good thing. So you have it both ways. You say, well, yes, the US is trying to, but only for human rights. Or you're crazy for suggesting that the US government is trying to overthrow, because you're somehow now like people who believe that the Pentagon and the aliens have a special office, liaison office together. So suddenly all these things are called conspiracy theories and they are dismissed. It's a very clever way to ideologically create, to delegitimize a criticism of US foreign policy. So this is a part where I would call, the production of amnesia. It's a very important part of the hybrid war. The hybrid war requires the ideological terrain to be commanded by the US government. And the government has been extremely successful in this way. Media houses and so on, they essentially prefer to have retired generals talk about foreign policy than people who are critics of the government. It's extremely normal to see that, as the way that they operate. Now, to pivot back to the idea of the hybrid war, I'd like to just suggest maybe 2 or 3 concepts that we need to bear in mind. And these concepts are about the goals, basically, not publicly, because these are internal US documents, but these are the goals shared by people inside the US State Department, the Pentagon, the various departments of defense, in Defense Intelligence Agency, National Security Council, and so on. This is a shared understanding. From the first concept that I'd like to put on the table is the concept of primacy. From the 1940s, I'm going to read from a document, 1947. From the 1940s, the US government has made it clear that the goal of US foreign policy is to seek this concept which they call primacy. That the US must have primacy over the world. And this statement from a State Department document, 1947, makes this clear. They say, to seek less than preponderant power would be to opt for defeat. In other words, the point isn't to have a balance of power in the world or anything. It's to seek preponderant power, to seek primacy. Preponderant power must be the object of US policy. I'm not saying that the US government is seeking preponderant power. The US government has said this in 1947, and then the evidence indicates that they have consistently attempted to attain this objective, whether it's overthrowing governments in Iran or in Chile in 1973, whether it's trying to utilize international agencies to funnel US interests through them, the IMF, the World Bank, creating groups like the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD in 1961, creating the Group of 7 countries in 1974. Each of these institutional arrangements are, in a sense, vehicles for pushing American power through them. So the US policy is primacy, and the evidence suggests that the US government has sought primacy. So that's the first concept I want to put on the table. If you go back and think about this amnesia, you never hear this kind of discussion in the culture industries, in the televisions or in print media, and very rarely in the academy do people start with a discussion, in a class on US foreign policy, that the objective is, to seek primacy. Generally, in a US foreign policy class, you'll start by talking about the different methods of understanding foreign policy, the realist method, the idealist method, etc. By the time you've gone through 2 weeks of method, your mind is entirely battered by, this sort of realist thinking, and you don't have a good grasp that underneath all this is seeking for preponderant power. As they say, preponderant power must be the objective of US policy. If I taught this class, I'd say, let's discuss that on the first day. But no, it doesn't even come up. The second concept, you have primacy first. Second concept is stability. It's an important concept. In that Kennedy report from 1962, they say that the US government must immunize vulnerable societies. Now, I'd just like to make a point on the side before coming back to this. We've periodized US foreign policy. On the one side, you say there's the Cold War. The other side is the war on terror. And the gap is somewhere in the 1990s. The Cold War, 1945 to the 1990s, and then from the 1990s onward, war on terror. In fact, I would say this is a completely erroneous periodization. This is one long period where it's a war against the United States seeking primacy on the one hand, and the forces of decolonization on the other. That's the real battle. The real battle is between the North and the South. And things like resource extraction and so on play a huge role. Why did the US government overthrow Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954? Well, because Arbenz was going to nationalize United Fruit, a major US-based multinational. Why did they overthrow Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran in 53? because Mossadegh was going to nationalize the oil fields and oil installations. Why did they overthrow Allende in Chile in 1973? Because Allende and the United Left movement was going to nationalize copper and telecommunications, and that was just not possible. And American-based multinationals basically pushed Nixon to overthrow the government through methodologies not directly with a US intervention, but by, as Nixon said, making the economy scream. In other words, using financial pressure, and on the other side, asking the Chilean military, led by Augusto Pinochet, to leave the barracks and overthrow the government. The United States could say, remember this, from Kennedy in 1962, we don't want to expose ourselves unnecessarily to charges of intervention and colonialism. When you read the correspondence between Nixon and Kissinger around the overthrow of Chile, they say to each other, we cannot allow our fingerprints to be on this coup d'etat. 20 years later, let it be public knowledge. But at the time, we don't want it to be public. It's very important to understand that this period from 1945 to the present is a fight between US imperialism on the one side, seeking preponderant power, and on the other side you have these people who are trying to use their resources to make some social wealth, to produce some form of social development. And every time they make a move, whether it's to do with fruit, whether it's to do with oil, whether it's to do with copper, they are simply not prevented. Various forms of war, military operations other than war, are used against them, governments are overthrown, and the resources are taken. This is a war in that sense between imperialism and decolonization. And it's been going on at least since the 1940s. So this idea of stability, what did the governments of the United States do? You see, from very early, the point was you don't want US troops to always enter. You want to Cubanize the conflict. 1961 attempt on Cuba through Bay of Pigs. Those were Cubans who landed there. Cubanized the conflict. In Vietnam, the Nixon administration tried to Vietnamize the conflict. You don't necessarily want to land US troops there. You want Vietnamese people to do your work for you. Or you want people, for instance, in Laos and Cambodia to be hired as mercenaries to do your work for you. All of this is familiar now. What's happening in Venezuela, you want to Venezuelanize the conflict. You want to create sharp divides in Venezuelan society. Let one faction of the bourgeoisie create, let's say, unrest in the country. Let them come in and do it. So Cubanize, Vietnamize, Venezuelanize. What does stability mean? And here we come to this Cubanize, Venezuelanize, and Vietnamize. What does stability mean? It means the concept of internal defense. This is the concept used by the US government from the 1950s. Internal defense. The concept of internal defense, they say, is to give governments over there in, let's say Chile and so on, the ability to maintain internal order. In other words, the US government will collaborate with dictators, authoritarians, monarchs, whatever it is, to create internal order. You'll have the sale of arms to these governments. You'll have what are known as international military education and training programs, or IMET, where soldiers from Panama, people like Manuel Noriega, will come to Fort Benning. They'll be trained and they will do the dirty work for the United States, maintaining order in those societies. What does order mean? Order means imperialism, the opposite of decolonization. You don't want those people to control their own resources. So you have these proxy groups, whether Manuel Noriega in Panama or Augusto Pinochet in Chile. You have these people essentially operate on behalf of the United States to create an authoritarian order so that the resources can be extracted. And if you don't accede to US preponderant power or to primacy, then all methods can be used to overthrow you. And that's where this a hybrid war becomes more and more sophisticated. On the one side, it's a communication war. Let's take Venezuela as an example in the time remaining. You have a communication war. You have to say that Maduro is a dictator. You have to demonstrate that Maduro is not fit to govern. Doesn't matter that he has, the support of half, 3/4 of the Venezuela. Doesn't matter. He has to be shown to be singular. And the whole Venezuelan people are against him. And he is using authoritarian violence to hold them down. I mean, this is the first thing you have to do. You have to create a kind of cultural, historical, ideological delegitimization of the government. And then the whole media has to collaborate in this. People even who feel they have some small criticism of the government come to the view that no, he has to be overthrown. He has to go. Maduro has to go. Castro has to go. That becomes the mantra. Assad has to go, and so on. So you delegitimize the government as it stands. That's a cultural, historical, and ideological game you play. Then you have to create distress inside the country. In fact, in the dossier we did on Venezuela and hybrid wars in Latin America, we quote these important US documents. One of them is from a former ambassador, William Broomfield, who said last year, he said, perhaps the best solution, now he's talking about the people of Venezuela, he says, perhaps the best solution would be to accelerate the collapse. We should do it understanding that it's going to have an impact on millions and millions of people who are already having great difficulty finding enough to eat. In other words, we're going to use financial techniques to create unrest inside Venezuela. So first, you've got to delegitimize the government. Second, you have to create economic and social unrest, divide the population. Doesn't matter that it's going to have an impact on millions and millions of people who are already having a difficult time finding enough to eat. The consequences don't matter. Create immense distress in the country. When you've created immense distress, fractures will start to happen among those who support the government. You will therefore then start to delegitimize not only historically, culturally, ideologically, but also socially. You will create social and economic distress. And now third, you support some non-entity, like in this case, Juan Guaido, a relatively unknown person, and say that he commands the loyalty of the people. You use every resource possible to put him as the legitimate ruler. This is the pretender ruler, as they used to say in the times of monarchy. You have this person suddenly and you build him up, you give him international support, diplomatic support, and so on. Sabotage operations can take place, military pressure can come. If you don't, you can tell the government, if you don't get out of power, we'll overthrow you by force. And there's examples of this. There's Brazil in 1964, where there was the US warships sat off the coast of Brazil, and those warships put pressure on the government in order to facilitate the coup. You had the mining of Managua Harbor in Nicaragua in 1979, trying to put pressure on the young government led by Daniel Ortega. Revolutionaries had taken power. You put US military pressure out. It's called gunboat diplomacy, and it's very effective in delegitimizing and creating terror inside a country. So, this is the kind of game plan, as we say, against a country like Venezuela. And here sanctions play a major role. Because, in this point where you have the creating of distress inside the country, the kind of fracturing of society, you use weapons like sanctions, financial sanctions, economic sanctions, individual sanctions. You use these to put the pressure on the country. As Nixon said of Chile, you make the economy scream. You fracture the country, you create distress, even if it means millions and millions of people who are already having great difficulty finding enough to eat. And to put this all together, you have the situation of Venezuela, you have the situation of Iran. I had earlier just said that what we have since the 1940s is a war between imperialism and the forces of decolonization. What makes Venezuela such a problem for places like the United States is that from when Chavez came to power in the late 1990s in an election, he has attempted to use the resources of Venezuela to better the lives of the Venezuelan people and the people of what is known as Patria Grande across Latin America. And that was an obscenity as far as the oil companies were concerned and the other mining companies. Peter Monk, who was the founder of Barrick Gold, the Canadian company, wrote a letter to the Financial Times viciously writing of Chavez as a dictator Why? Because Chavez was trying to change the agreements the previous government had made with the mining companies. That's why he was a dictator. He was a dictator not against his own people, but against the multinational corporations. And that's why he needed to be overthrown. I mean, I want this to be put right down there, that the point I'm making is this battle between the forces of imperialism, including, of course, the multinational corporations, and decolonization, which is a process very much part of the project of Bolivarian project of Hugo Chavez and the other states in Latin America. It's a fight between these two tendencies of imperialism and decolonization. And the methodology of military operations other than war or hybrid war is used against the forces of decolonization. And part of that, those operations, is the creation of a kind of amnesia about American power, an amnesia about the goals of American power, an implicit faith in American power, and then this belief that people have that they'll say, well, you know, I just don't like Maduro, he has to go. I mean, who asked your opinion? But he has to go. And, you know, I may not like Trump, but it's okay. Let Trump and, you know, previously Bolton and Pompeo, I mean, these kind of gangstery characters who operate on behalf of multinational corporations, I trust them more than I trust Maduro. I mean, that is an extraordinary place we are in. And it's because you see this view so commonly held. Because of that, you know that the concept of the hybrid war is not merely, you know, for the textbooks of political science, but indeed, it's a reality. In the earlier period, from, let's say, the 1940s to the 1980s, before the collapse of the USSR, international solidarity was a much easier concept to understand, because it was clearer that there was, at least from the global south, that there was a two-line struggle. There was on the one side the force of imperialism, and on the other side, there was the force of, say, the Third World Project, or decolonization, or what have you. It was a much clearer political divide. There were institutions of the Third World that were active in this. In 1961, in the United Nations, in fact, a resolution was passed by the General Assembly in which there's a line which, you know, for me captures it beautifully. The line is, the process of liberation is irresistible. I mean, you know, you cannot imagine after the fall of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Third World Project, you cannot imagine a line like that written by the countries of the global south collectively to champion, you know, solidarity for decolonization, national liberation, and so on. After the 1990s, an immense fragmentation takes place among states, inside social movements, and a new influence comes, particularly from the cultural industries of the West, to delegitimize national liberation as a project, to delegitimize, you know, governments and peoples who are fighting for justice. You know, it's very interesting how so rapidly in a few years you move from, you know, a political force that says the process of liberation is irresistible to people who say, well, look, all we can do is maybe improve the water quality somewhere. All we can do is, you know, help some people get literacy or housing, all important issues. But they are fragmented, no longer part of a project called, say, liberation or national liberation or emancipation of peoples. I mean, these concepts start to by themselves appear naive. And you can mock the person who talks about emancipation or, you know, revolutionary change. You know, you sound ridiculous in this period because they have made you ridiculous. In the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, there were institutions, popular movements that had made these ideas absolutely legitimate. It was legitimate to talk about liberation. After the 1990s, liberation itself becomes a curious term. And this is why international solidarity now is so difficult. It's not just that, well, you know, people are busy or they're, you know, on their iPhones. It's not that. It's that the political context has changed from the context where solidarity for international liberation was, you know, a legitimate thing because international solidarity was backing something that was legitimate, which was liberation, emancipation, socialism, and so on. What your solidarity was for was itself legitimate. Now you can have international solidarity, but it's not for the same kinds of things. You can have international solidarity saying, I'm in solidarity to get somebody removed from prison somewhere, or I'm in solidarity for people to have good drinking water. I'm in solidarity against the climate being destroyed. You can have a big climate strike and so on. These things are possible. So, in other words, it's not the solidarity that has disappeared, the international solidarity, that carries over. It's what are you in solidarity for? In this new period, being in solidarity for the forces of decolonization has been delegitimized. That's the main point I think we should consider. Why is it that people have such a hard time now being in favor of countries or movements that have a strong decolonization philosophy or position? Because the idea of decolonization now sounds ridiculous to lots of people as a consequence of the erosion of faith in this idea by the culture industries which are so close to the US State Department. I mean, even consider the fight for the liberation of Palestine. Even the BDS movement and other strong movements, even these movements, they are so strongly attacked. People attack them on the grounds of anti-Semitism or whatever, that it's hard for them to sustain themselves and become mass movements of a kind that were there for Cuba, for instance, before the fall of the Soviet Union. Mass solidarity campaign for Cuba. Mass solidarity campaign in solidarity with the people of Vietnam in their war against the United States. You just don't see that any longer for decolonization struggles. It's one thing to argue for the Palestinian prisoners on human rights grounds, but to say we demand the decolonization of Palestine, not a legitimate. That's not only because of Palestine, that's because the concept of decolonization has been delegitimized. It's so important, therefore, for us to understand if we're going to reanimate international solidarity for decolonization, if you want to have a solidarity campaign for Venezuela, for instance, you have to fight for the idea of decolonization, the right of people, the Venezuelan people, to control their resources, to control their destiny. I mean, this has to be fought for. It's not that you're fighting for the government or you're fighting for this or that. You're fighting for the project of decolonization. You're fighting for the people of Western Sahara. You're fighting for the Palestinians. You're fighting for the Cubans. You're fighting for people who want to chart a path that's different from the path that's placed upon them by the imperialist bloc, including the IMF and others. Argentina has an election. That election is between the forces of imperialism and the IMF, the government of Mr. Macri, on the one side, and then the forces of decolonization on the other. You've got to add in the bloc of Patria Grande, Frente Patria Grande, of course the Peronists and others, they want to control their resources in order to produce a society where people are not starving, where their currency is, deteriorated terribly, where it's difficult to mobilize basic resources to take care of, basic human needs. I mean, that's the fight. And that's how we need to understand it. This is not a fight in just one country or against one adversary. This is a much broader fight in real terms to save humanity and the planet. It's a fight between imperialism and decolonization. Now, if you want to stand with imperialism, that's fine. And you can make it clear and go in that direction. But if you believe in the forces of decolonization, it's really important to stand up and say so. I mean, people somehow feel that there's a kind of naivete, or they don't want to, stand up. They would prefer to have a more nuanced understanding of the world. Nuance is important and fine in analysis, in appreciating things, but sometimes in politics, nuance has its problems. To be nuanced on the situation in Venezuela leaves you in the middle. And, as people like Howard Zinn said quite clearly, you can't be neutral on a moving train. It's difficult to be nuanced when a country is facing the kind of hybrid war that Venezuela is facing. On the one side, you have the forces of imperialism. They are quite clear and easy to identify. On the other side, you have the forces of decolonization. And that's the people of Venezuela, the bulk of the poor Afro-Venezuelans who back the government because they see the government as a shield against imperialism. You have some Problems with the government, that's fine. You should articulate them. You should make it clear that, there are ways to improve the situation, whatever. That's okay. That's fine. But that's not a reason to go to the camp of imperialism. Fidel Castro used to say, if you make a criticism of Cuba, it depends on your outlook, on how you are criticizing. Castro said, if you are inside the revolution, if you're for the revolution and you make a criticism, that's fine. Criticism inside the revolution, totally acceptable. Criticism against the revolution, totally unacceptable, because then you're essentially saying, I'm in the camp who wants to overthrow the revolution. I'm in the camp of imperialism. That's okay. You're welcome to join that camp. One should be clear about this. In a time of intense struggle, when there's an attempt to overthrow a government, there really are only two camps. There is no third way. There is no other option. Now, once the forces of revolution are able to prevail, then they must deepen the revolution. Criticism must come from inside the revolution. You must deepen it. But at the time of this intense tension, to say that I'm neutral or I'm uninterested puts you into the camp of imperialism. And as I said, that is an option. It is a legitimate option. It's not for me. I fundamentally and firmly believe in the process of decolonization. That 1961 UN resolution is basically a resolution that I think is my motto. And it says again, just to repeat it, and I'm going to close with this because I'd really like you to reflect on this statement, this sentence. The sentence is, the process of liberation is irresistible. The process of liberation is irresistible. In other words, it is irresistible in so many different ways. It's irresistible because how can you not resist being part of the process of liberation? Why would you want to be with the oppressor? Why not with the oppressed? It's irresistible. And the other side of irresistible is it will prevail because, you cannot resist it. You cannot fight against it. The people will eventually prevail. The future is for humanity. The choice is either you're for humanity or you're for death. If the future is for death, well, then there's no question of, being a victor. Everybody is going to die. If the future is for humanity, that's the irresistible. So the process of liberation is irresistible.